With that being said, I want to bring up our first storyteller of the evening.
When she went to work. Now, you may think of Brazil as the land of samba, beautiful beaches, and soccer, but what you may not know is that Brazil is one of the places in the world with the highest rates of violence against women. And so, where do I go next?
I've been working really hard to feel prepared, and it's kind of strange to say that, but I feel prepared. Watch me mess it all up on the stage on Wednesday. My name is Janine Mapurunga. My story is about my experience being born into a very hostile environment because of the fact that I'm a woman, and how that ties into my discovery of art.
When I was 10 years old, my grandma asked me what I wanted for Christmas, and knowing that she didn't have much money, I said, don't worry about it, Grandma, I don't need anything.
I felt a lot of resistance when I first started working on the story. I thought about quitting many times and not sharing the story because I felt very exposed, I felt very vulnerable. So when I hear the stories of the other folks who are in my group, it fills my heart with this sense of gratitude for their vulnerability, which also makes it okay for me to be vulnerable. I open, they open, we are all sharing.
At the age of 16, she left everything she knew and came to California alone in search of a place where she could spread her wings. As a documentary photographer and filmmaker, she helps people tell their stories through her work as a visual storyteller. With the help of Capital Storytelling, Janine began sharing her own stories. Going from behind the camera to the spotlight is a scary thing for her, but she decided to do it because she believes in the power of oral storytelling. Please join me in welcoming Janine and Janine's story, My First Camera.
Good evening, everyone. A round of applause for
Capital Storytelling reached out to me and invited me to tell this story. I felt conflicted because on the one hand I felt this is my personal life and I'm not used to sharing my story publicly at all. But at the same time, I felt that if they are inviting me to share the story, then they must see the value in, if other people hear my story.
I said, don't worry about it, Grandma. I don't need anything. But she insisted. She said, what do you really want? And I said, well, what I really want is a camera. And so she asked my mother to take me to the camera store to pick out a camera. And at the camera store, I asked the salesman, which one is your cheapest camera? And he handed me this camera right here. It's a plastic point and shoot with a plastic lens. And my grandma bought this camera and a roll of film, which she paid for in 5 monthly installments. I shot the whole roll of film. It was all portraits of my dog. And when I got to the end of the film, I got super excited. And I ran back in the house and I started jumping around. I just shot my first roll of film. I just shot my first roll of film. And in the living room, my relatives were there watching TV. There were adults, there were kids, and nobody paid attention to me. They just kept watching TV. except for my uncle, who turned toward me and he said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's a camera." And he said, "Let me see it." So I handed him the camera and he said, "How do you open it?" And I pointed to the button, which he immediately pressed, and he opened the back of the camera and he pulled out the whole roll of film, ruining all of my work. And he handed it back to me, the camera and the film, and he said, "This is not a child's toy." And then he turned back and went back to the TV.
The culture in which I was born in Brazil, they don't really like if you talk about trauma or violence against women. It's there is a tradition of blaming the victim and saying that, don't say those things.
About a year later, when I was 11 years old, my mother showed up to work one morning and she was laughing really hard, and she was telling her coworkers, "You would not believe what my daughter said last night. She said she's gonna leave the country. Where do kids get these ideas?" I was bullied in school, at home, in sports, and I just didn't feel like there was a safe place for me to be. When I was 13 years old, I started to work after school, tutoring the kids who were younger than me because I wanted to save money to become an exchange student. And by the time I was 15, my mother started to take me seriously. So I needed a passport. And my mother took me to the passport office, where they told us that in order for me to get a passport, they needed my father's signature on the document. He yelled a bunch of obscenities on the phone, and he accused my mother of wanting to prostitute me in another country. And he said that if it was up to him, I would never get a passport. Some time passed, and my father, he was an entrepreneur. He was a business owner. And so I thought, well, maybe he'll give me a job. So I called him, and he said, yeah, he would hire me. So I started working at his office, and my job was to do data entry and paperwork. And one day, I was asked to take some documents for his office for him to sign, and that evening, you know where this is going, audience. Thank you. I needed that energy. I'm on the hot seat up here. And so that evening, I went home with one of those documents, and the next morning I called and I quit my job and I started to practice how to write my father's signature. So I wrote my father's signature on the passport document, and that's how I got my passport.
My story is also about understanding from a very early age that we're not confined to the circumstances in which we're born. We can create our own path.
I arrived in California as an exchange student, where I enrolled in high school as a senior at a place called Elk Grove. Some of you might know where that is. And I got super excited because I found out that they had photography classes at this high school. And in Brazil, they didn't teach art in school. So I went to the office to sign up for photography class, but they told me that the class was full. They said, "There's no room for you in photography class." So I went to talk to the photography teacher, and I begged him and I said, "Please, please, 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 will you please find me a spot in your photography class? And he said, I'm sorry, the class is full. There is no room for you in photography class. But then he offered me a deal. He said that if I stayed after school and helped him clean the darkroom, he would teach me photography. And that's how I got my first photography lessons. Now we fast forward to today, and I've been a professional photographer my entire adult life. And thinking back at my trajectory, I think about my grandma. It's really hard work being a working artist, but it was inspired by her that I chose this career path. And then I think about my high school photography teacher, this man from another country who met me one time, a teenage girl from a faraway land with a thick accent. And he decided to invest in me. The thing is we're not confined to the environment in which we're born. We're not restricted to the circumstances in which we grow up. We can create our own path.